Here's a question that should bother you. Why does Canada, a nation blessed with vast natural resources, an educated workforce, and political stability, rank dead last in economic productivity among advanced nations? The answer is hiding in plain sight, written on the for sale signs dotting every suburban street. While other developed countries spent the past decade building companies, patents, and technologies, Canada chose a different path. The country decided that the surest route to prosperity was to buy and sell the same houses to each other at perpetually escalating prices. Residential real estate became the national obsession, the primary vehicle for wealth creation, the cornerstone of retirement planning, and the singular focus of economic policy. But here's the problem with treating shelter as a speculative asset class. When the price of a basic human need quintuples while wages stagnate, something breaks. Not suddenly, like a stock market crash, but slowly, like a weight-bearing beam that fractures bit by bit until the whole structure collapses. This is that story. It's the account of how one of the world's wealthiest nations engineered its own economic stagnation, trapped an entire generation in debt servitude, and now teeters on the edge of either a devastating crash or decades of Japanese-style malaise. Capital's betrayal, the innovation desert. Every thriving economy requires capital to flow toward productive ventures. Money should chase ideas, technologies, infrastructure, the building blocks of future prosperity. Instead, Canadian capital went somewhere else entirely. Consider what $1.5 million represents. That sum could finance a small biotechnology startup working on cancer treatments. It could fund 3 years of artificial intelligence research. It could capitalize a manufacturing firm creating export products. These investments generate jobs, intellectual property, and economic growth that compounds over time. Or in contemporary Canada, that $1.5 million buys you a century-old house with structural issues in metropolitan Toronto. Not even a particularly nice house. Just shelter. The same shelter that provided identical utility 50 years ago when it cost $80,000 before inflation became untethered from value. This misallocation of resources represents Canada's fundamental economic illness. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development examined long-term growth prospects for developed nations and reached a sobering conclusion. Canada will post the weakest performance among advanced economies through 2030 and likely through 2060. Not weak, the weakest. Dead last for 4 consecutive decades. Why? The data tells a clear story. In late 2023, Canadian investment in residential structures roughly doubled the combined investment in non-residential structures and machinery. Think about that ratio. A nation spending twice as much on housing people as on tools to make them productive. Meanwhile, American capital was flowing into NVIDIA, developing AI chips, into Tesla, revolutionizing transportation, into Microsoft, building cloud infrastructure. Canada's investors were buying pre-construction condos in Mississauga. The feedback loop became self-reinforcing. A townhouse purchased for $400,000 in 2015 sells for $650,000 in 2020 with 0 improvements. That's a 62% return for doing absolutely nothing. No sweat equity, no value creation, just benefiting from scarcity. What rational investor risks capital on a manufacturing venture that might fail when guaranteed returns await in residential property? But rental income and capital gains don't create productivity. They extract it. When a house doubles in value, it doesn't become twice as useful. It still provides the same 4 walls and a roof. The only change is that twice as much capital is now locked away, unavailable for productive deployment. This dynamic explains Canada's productivity crisis. Real estate and related industries now comprise roughly 20 to 25% of the nation's economic output, an extraordinarily high concentration for a developed economy. The country essentially transformed itself into a giant landlord. But landlording creates no new value. It simply transfers wealth from renters to property owners, from the young to the old, from workers to asset holders. And now, Canada has become too large to fail at real estate. If housing corrects significantly, the entire economic structure collapses. Banks fail. Construction halts. Consumer spending evaporates. The government, fully aware of this trap, has committed itself to preventing any meaningful price decline, regardless of the long-term consequences. The debt trap. Borrowing against mirages. The capital misallocation created one crisis. Household debt created another. Imagine a couple. Call them Sarah and Michael. In 2016, they stretched to purchase a suburban home for $550,000. 5 years later, in 2021, a bank appraiser tells them the property is now worth $1.3 million. Sarah and Michael feel wealthy, even though they can't eat drywall or pay tuition with appreciation. Their standard of living hasn't changed, but on paper, they've gained $750,000. Then comes the phone call from their bank. "You're sitting on untapped equity," says the friendly voice. "Why not access it?" So Sarah and Michael open a home equity line of credit. The money feels free, conjured from thin air, or at least from the collective delusion that house prices only rise. They spend it. A new vehicle, kitchen renovation, maybe a down payment on a rental condo to generate passive income. This is how modern Canadian prosperity worked, not through rising wages or increased productivity, but through borrowing against inflating assets.
By 2024, Canadian household debt had reached approximately 175% of disposable income. Put simply, for every dollar earned, households owed $1.75 in debt. While this marked a slight improvement from the peak of 179% reached years earlier, it remained among the most elevated ratios in the developed world, far exceeding the United States' 123%.
The difference between Canada and America is striking. After the 2008 financial crisis, American households deleveraged. They paid down mortgages, reduced credit card balances, rebuilt savings. Canadians looked at 2008 and said, "Hold my beer." Debt levels continued climbing, fueled by historically low interest rates and the conviction that real estate never loses value. But here's what happens when that conviction meets reality. Those home equity lines carried variable interest rates. When the Bank of Canada held rates at 0.25%, servicing a $200,000 HELOC cost about $40 monthly, effectively free money. Then inflation forced the central bank's hand. Throughout 2022 and 2023, rates climbed aggressively. Suddenly, that same $200,000 line of credit demanded $833 monthly just to cover interest. Sarah and Michael's free money evaporated. Their monthly debt service tripled. Every dollar going toward interest became a dollar unavailable for groceries, childcare, or retirement savings. The wealth effect reversed into a poverty effect. When people feel rich because their house appreciated, they spend more. When they feel poor because debt service consumes their paycheck, they spend less. Restaurants empty. Retailers close. The broader economy contracts. Even worse, Canadian banks revealed a phenomenon called negative amortization. This occurs when monthly payments fail to cover accruing interest, causing the principal balance to grow rather than shrink. Throughout 2023 and 2024, financial institutions disclosed that substantial portions of their mortgage portfolios had amortization periods extending beyond 35, 40, even 70 years. 70 years. That's not a mortgage. That's a lifestyle. You won't live to see it paid off. Your children will inherit it. Canada invented intergenerational debt obligations just to maintain the illusion that housing prices couldn't fall. The economy now walks a knife's edge. Consumer spending drives economic growth. But if disposable income gets devoured by debt service, nobody buys anything. We built a consumption model on borrowed money and rising home values. When both reverse simultaneously, the system fails. The demographic mirage, growth without prosperity. If you follow mainstream economic reporting, you'd believe Canada's economy is thriving. Look at the GDP growth figures, politicians say. We're outperforming our peers. Here's what they're not telling you. Imagine 10 people sharing 12 pizzas. Everyone eats well. Now imagine 20 people sharing 13 pizzas. Technically, Total pizza volume increased, but per-person consumption crashed. This is Canada's economic growth. In 2023, Canada's population surged by over 1.27 million people, representing 3.2% annual growth, the fastest expansion since 1957. That's roughly equivalent to adding the entire population of Estonia in 12 months. Immigration itself isn't the problem. The problem is that Canada invited 1 million people to dinner without setting additional places at the table. No new hospitals were built to handle the increased patient load. Transit systems remained unchanged despite surging ridership. And most critically, housing construction failed to keep pace with population growth by an enormous margin. The result was predictable. Rents skyrocketed, home prices climbed further out of reach, and per capita living standards declined even as aggregate GDP grew. Economists at the National Bank of Canada and CIBC called this the population trap. When you flood the labor market with workers, wage growth stagnates. Why would a corporation invest in expensive productivity-enhancing automation when it can simply hire abundant cheap labor? They wouldn't, and they didn't. While the United States automated and increased efficiency, Canada became less productive. We substituted warm bodies for technological advancement. While recent government policies have dramatically slowed population growth, even producing a slight decline by late 2025, this reversal came only after the damage was done. The housing shortage created during the 2021-2023 boom remains. The infrastructure deficit persists, and per capita GDP continues languishing below pre-pandemic levels. Here's the crucial distinction. When politicians celebrate rising aggregate GDP, they're measuring whether the national pie grew. But what matters to individual citizens is GDP per capita, whether each person's slice grew. On that measure, Canada has been in recession for multiple consecutive quarters. Individual Canadians are getting materially poorer, even as the country appears superficially wealthier. This demographic strategy benefited one group disproportionately: existing property owners. Every additional million people arriving with nowhere to live drives demand higher, pushing prices and rents upward. If you owned real estate before 2015, your wealth soared. If you didn't, you became increasingly desperate. Canada engineered a massive wealth transfer from newcomers and young Canadians to established homeowners, disguising it as economic policy. Moral hazard: when government becomes the dealer. In a genuine free market, asset bubbles eventually correct. Prices rise, buyers balk, demand falls, prices decline. But Canada's housing market isn't a free market. It's a protected asset class, shielded by government intervention at every turn. Why? Because homeowners vote. And no political party wants to face the electoral consequences of allowing housing prices to fall 20%. A correction of that magnitude would trigger immediate government collapse. So instead of allowing markets to clear, policymakers deployed every tool available to prevent the inevitable. Consider the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. This crown corporation insures mortgages for buyers who can't afford the traditional 20% down payment. Here's the critical detail. The insurance protects banks, not borrowers. If you default, the lender gets made whole by CMHC. The bank takes virtually zero risk when lending $500,000 to a borderline qualified borrower. Does that sound like a system encouraging responsible lending? Or one incentivizing banks to shovel money out the door as fast as humanly possible? When stress began appearing in 2023 and 2024, government panic became palpable. Policymakers extended amortization periods, hoping to reduce monthly payments. They purchased billions in Canada mortgage bonds, injecting liquidity into the system. They floated ideas about 30-year mortgages for first-time buyers. Every time market forces tried to assert themselves, government intervened with a defibrillator, screaming, "Not on our watch." They're attempting to outlaw gravity. But the fundamental problem with trying to ban natural forces is that eventually you exhaust your energy, and the fall becomes catastrophic. It's like refusing to allow small forest fires. You accumulate so much dry fuel that the eventual blaze threatens to incinerate everything. By preventing any housing correction, the government has created extraordinary moral hazard. Banks know they'll be bailed out. Borrowers believe the government will always cushion the blow. Speculators conclude that downside risk has been socialized, while upside profits remain private. Everyone takes excessive risks because somebody else will pay when those risks materialize. This isn't economic policy. It's addiction management. And like any addiction, temporary relief comes at the cost of long-term devastation. The new feudalism. Landlords and serfs. Let's discuss what this has done to Canadian society, because the economic damage is only part of the story. For generations, Canada offered an implicit contract: work hard, save money, buy property, retire comfortably. That contract is dead. In its place, a rigid economic caste system has emerged. Class 1, the landed gentry. These are Canadians who purchased real estate before 2015. They're not necessarily smarter or harder working than anyone else. They were simply born earlier, in an era when housing cost less than 3 times the median income. These property owners now sit on millions in tax-free capital gains. They leverage their equity to acquire rental properties, effectively taxing the income of Class 2. Class 2, the serfs. Young people, recent immigrants, anyone who missed the boat. They pay 50 to 60% of their income to Class 1 just for basic shelter. Because rent consumes everything, they can't save for a down payment. The ladder has been pulled up. Upward mobility is dead. This isn't just about money, it's about life. When housing costs absorb your entire paycheck, you delay marriage. You postpone having children. You put your life on hold. The statistics confirm this. Canada's fertility rate reached a new record low of 1.25 children per woman in 2024, marking the second consecutive year of ultra-low fertility, as defined by demographers. This isn't accidental. Canadians are making rational economic calculations. They can't afford children. They can't afford the space children require. So they opt out of parenthood entirely. You see 30-year-old professionals, engineers, lawyers, teachers, living with 3 roommates or moving back with their parents. It creates a state of arrested development. You can't feel like an adult when you're asking your mother's permission to have a date sleepover at age 32. The inequality breeds resentment. Walk down any urban street and witness the disconnect. Someone who bought a bungalow for $200,000 in 1995 now drives a luxury vehicle purchased with home equity, while literally 5 blocks away, tent encampments house people priced out entirely. That visceral inequality becomes unsustainable. And here's the cruelest irony. Every government policy ostensibly designed to help affordability actually makes things worse. First-time buyer programs? They add demand, which raises prices. Lower interest rates? More demand, higher prices. The system is designed to protect existing owners at the expense of aspiring ones. History teaches that when societies create permanent underclasses with no realistic path to ownership, things get volatile. Canada is building precisely that scenario, then wondering why social cohesion frays. The Laundromat, when cartels become your competition. If you thought the only people buying Canadian real estate were hard-working families, let me introduce you to snowwashing. International criminal organizations have a problem. How do you legitimize proceeds from drug trafficking, corruption, and fraud? The answer for decades was Canada, specifically British Columbia. Canada maintained some of the weakest financial transparency laws among developed nations. You could purchase a $15 million penthouse through a numbered company owned by a shell corporation registered in the Seychelles, controlled by a trust in the British Virgin Islands. Nobody knew who actually owned the property. This opacity made Canada a magnet for dirty money. The operation became known as the Vancouver model. Here's how it worked. Criminals walked into lower mainland casinos carrying hockey bags stuffed with cash, literally small denomination bills in sports bags. They purchased gambling chips, played briefly, then cashed out. The casino provided a check, money laundered. That clean money then flowed directly into real estate purchases. A British Columbia expert panel estimated that $7.4 billion was laundered in the province in 2018 alone, with $5 billion flowing through real estate markets. That volume of illicit capital distorts everything, When you're bidding on a house, you're not just competing against other Canadian families. You're competing against international crime syndicates for whom the purchase price is irrelevant. They're not seeking housing, they're parking assets. The cartel doesn't care if they overpay by $100,000. They need the transaction, not the property. So they bid above market, driving prices up for everyone. This converted major cities into safety deposit boxes for global criminals, while ordinary citizens were relegated to basement suites. Government knew, regulators knew, and for years, they turned a blind eye because those billions helped provincial budgets balance. The economic activity looked good on paper, even though it was fundamentally corrupt. The exodus, subsidizing America's success. Here's what happens when you make it impossible for talented people to afford living in their own country. They leave. Consider a 25-year-old software engineer graduating from the University of Waterloo, one of the world's premier technology schools. She faces a choice. Option A, Toronto salary, 85,000 Canadian dollars. Rent, $36,000 annually for a one-bedroom. After tax and rent, maybe 25,000 remaining savings. Impossible health care. Free, if you can find a doctor accepting patients. Option B, Austin, Texas. Salary, 140,000 US dollars, roughly 190,000 Canadian. Housing, larger house, lower cost. After tax and housing, enough to save and invest. Healthcare, costs more, but actually available. This isn't a difficult decision. She moves to Texas. Canada subsidized her education, trained her skills, and then handed her to the American economy as a gift. The data confirms this isn't an isolated case. Canadian emigration to the United States has surged. We're bleeding our best and brightest because we can't offer them a viable economic future. The people who build companies, invent patents, and generate high-value employment are departing. Those remaining are either anchored by property ownership or unable to leave. You can't build a successful economy on coffee shops and real estate commissions. You need engineers, doctors, researchers, entrepreneurs. But why would a doctor remain when housing costs consume 60% of their take-home pay? Canada has become a nursery and a nursing home. We raise the young, they leave during their productive years, and maybe they return when they're elderly to use the healthcare system. That's a recipe for national bankruptcy. The end of the road. Crash or stagnation. So how does this end? Economists generally see two scenarios, neither pleasant. Scenario 1, the crash. Housing prices plummet 30 to 50%. This is the 2008 American-style implosion. Banks collapse because their mortgage portfolios become worthless. Construction halts entirely. Millions lose their jobs. The Canadian dollar crashes. It's chaos for 2 to 3 years. But here's the catch. Remember Section 4. Government will do anything to prevent this. They'll print money, bail out everyone, extend amortization periods to a century if necessary. Which brings us to Scenario 2, Japanification. This is more likely and arguably more painful. In the 1990s, Japan's real estate bubble burst. Rather than allowing markets to clear, authorities kept zombie companies alive with cheap debt. The result? 30 years of zero growth. Wages flatlined. The stock market went nowhere. A slow, grinding erosion of living standards. Canada stares down that barrel. Nominal housing prices might stay elevated while inflation erodes purchasing power. We won't see a spectacular crash. Instead, we'll see a low-growth, high-cost stagnation. The wealthy will own everything. The poor will serve them. The ambitious will leave. We're trading future dynamism for present stability. We're choosing comfort today at the cost of prosperity tomorrow. And here's the deepest tragedy. When an entire generation spends their mental energy worrying about rent, mortgage rates, and housing scarcity, they're not thinking about art, science, business innovation, or community building. We've trapped our collective potential inside 4 walls of overpriced drywall. Breaking free. A path forward. Is this hopeless? Should you emigrate to wherever property remains affordable? Not necessarily. But fixing this requires a fundamental cultural shift. First, stop celebrating when housing prices rise. High housing costs aren't wealth creation. They're inflation, plain and simple. They represent policy failure. When your neighbor's house appreciates 15%, that's not a victory. It means your children can't afford to live in their hometown. Second, demand that politicians prioritize productive investment over property protection. Tax speculation heavily. Redirect capital toward business formation, research, infrastructure, anything that actually creates value. Stop bailing out banks and start building companies. Third, increase supply dramatically. Not just any housing, but affordable housing near employment centers. And simultaneously, reduce demand. End tax incentives that treat housing as investment rather than shelter. For young Canadians, don't let FOMO destroy your life. Don't take on a 40-year mortgage that strangles you just because society says home ownership equals success. Renting isn't failure. Investing in your skills, your mobility, and your freedom often provides better returns than over-leveraging yourself into a suburban box. And for homeowners sitting on millions in paper equity, understand that your wealth exists at your children's expense. The ladder you climbed is the same one you're kicking down. This country possesses everything necessary to be an economic superpower. Natural resources, educated people, political stability, peace. But we've locked it all inside a speculative real estate bubble. It's time to find the key. If you found this analysis valuable, please like and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. And check out our other video examining how Poland managed to build a robust economy without falling into the real estate trap. Stay solvent. Stay curious. I'll see you in the next one.